Young Frankenstein was never just an architect of laughter. In the shadows of its frame, it may have ignited one of the most defining rock anthems in American history. When Aerosmith found themselves suffocating in the dead air of a recording studio, they wandered into a darkened cinema, watched a limping Igor on screen, and heard three exact syllables.
Walk this way.
Three syllables that walked right out of the celluloid and into the annals of rock and roll. But that is merely one of the bizarre paradoxes lurking beneath the surface of this film: an A-list star erasing his own name, a noble descendant burying his bloodline, and Mel Brooks himself banished from the flesh of his own creation. 1. The A-lister who erased his own name. In 1974, Gene Hackman reigned over an empire most actors only dream of. He had just swept the Academy Awards, clutching the Oscar for his gritty, violent portrayal of Detective Popeye Doyle in The French Connection. He was the ultimate box office guarantee, a titan for whom studios would roll out the red carpet. But behind the blinding halo of fame, Hackman was suffocating under the rigid templates of crime thrillers. He needed an escape route. During a weekend tennis match beneath the scorching California sun, he turned to his co-star Gene Wilder, swung his racket, and asked bluntly, "Is there any room for me in this crazy project of yours? I just want to try comedy, just once." The Young Frankenstein production was currently bleeding money, tightening its belt on every single design element. The budget was bone dry. There was no hidden vault to pay an A-list superstar's asking price. Met with Wilder's hesitant shake of the head, Hackman delivered a chillingly decisive ultimatum. "I don't want money, I just want to do it." And he did. Weeks later, Hackman materialized on set. He draped himself in filthy rags, smeared grime across his face, and concealed his eyes behind dead, white, colorblind lenses. He didn't take a single dime, shooting the entire role of the blind hermit in a mere 24 hours. But the condition attached to his performance was what truly bewildered the producers. He forced director Mel Brooks to completely obliterate his name from the end credits. Hackman's reasoning was ice cold. He didn't want the audience distracted. He wanted the character to exist in a vacuum, unswallowed by the behemoth of his own fame. This phantom performance by a Hollywood titan created a stunning highlight. But beneath it, another vicious war had already erupted while the project was still ink on paper, a war that threatened to tear the very soul of the film apart. 2. Gene Wilder's threat of sabotage. The ink on the 20th Century Fox contract was barely dry when a new battle line was drawn. This time, the war zone was the very first line of text on the script's cover. For the massive Hollywood studios of 1974, a title was a calculated financial instrument before it was anything else. It had to scream from posters, blaze on theater marquees, and leap out of tiny print ads in the culture section. It had to instantly spoon-feed the masses exactly what they were buying. Anything too subversive, too ambiguous, or too intelligent was deemed an unacceptable commercial hazard. Fox executives stared at the title Young Frankenstein with mounting dread. They scrutinized box office data, slid dry reports across mahogany tables, and concluded the phrase was far too unorthodox. The masses might be confused. The suits relentlessly applied pressure, convening emergency meetings to force the creative team into renaming the film Frankenstein Returns or Son of Frankenstein safe. Sterilized, cookie-cutter titles designed to effortlessly siphon cash from nostalgic horror fans. What they failed to calculate was that Gene Wilder had not entered that boardroom as a hired gun. He arrived as the architect who had bled over every page with Mel Brooks in a cramped Bel Air hotel bungalow, night after night, following grueling shoots for Blazing Saddles, fueled by Earl Grey tea and British digestive biscuits. Young Frankenstein wasn't a gig. It was a monolith he had built from a frantic scribble on a scrap of paper, leaning against the wooden facade of a fake Western town. The title wasn't a negotiable detail, it was the spinal cord of the entire vision. Wilder, the co-writer and leading man, stepped into the room, stripped of his chaotic on-screen persona, Wilder's demeanor was razor-sharp. He swatted away the executive's circular diplomacy. No negotiations, no compromises. Wilder slammed down a terminal ultimatum if the title was altered by so much as a single letter. He would immediately vacate the lead role and pull his entire involvement from the film. Mel Brooks, seated beside him, said absolutely nothing. That heavy silence was the second answer. The boardroom plunged into a suffocating quiet. The executives looked down at the data sheets in front of them. They knew they were staring down two men who had written together, bled together, and were standing shoulder to shoulder. There was no crack to wedge a crowbar into, facing the absolute destruction of the script and the loss of its two central pillars. The studio heads were forced to swallow their bile. They retreated. The title remained untouched. The film would go on to gross over $80 million on a $3 million budget, becoming one of the most lucrative gambles of 1974. None of the men in that boardroom ever publicly spoke of the title war again, while the leading man wielded his power to protect the identity of the film. Down in the trenches of the background extras, another man was desperately trying to bury his own. 3. The true genesis of a historic anthem. The sound stages of 20th Century Fox were drenched in blinding lights and agonizing tension. Contrary to the glittering illusions of the audience, filming a comedy is a devoid of joy. Behind the lens, it is a dry, mechanical, and soul-draining process of human endurance. Director Mel Brooks was an extremist in his perfectionism. Actors were forced to loop a single footstep, a breath, a twitch of the brow, until he finally nodded. It was the day they were shooting the Transylvania train station sequence. The air on set was thick with exhaustion. The technical crew was decaying from hours of relentless labor. Marty Feldman, cloaked in the deformity of Igor, stood waiting for the camera. He was a creature of Britain's old vaudeville stages, a realm where a performer had to use every physical trick to manipulate a restless mob. Feldman read the dead air in the room. He knew something had to detonate. The moment the camera rolled, he shattered the tension with a relic of classic stagecraft. Feldman grabbed a wooden cane, handed it to Gene Wilder, and suddenly limped forward, tossing over his shoulder a sharp, unscripted line. "Walk this way." No script, no calculation, a cheap, raw gag deployed solely to harvest a few laughs and peel the fatigue off the crew hiding behind the equipment. They called cut. The production moved on, and not a single soul gave the line a second thought. 1 year later, 1975, the East Coast, inside the record plant studio in the dead heart of New York. The members of a rock band were backed into a corner. They were tracking their third album, Toys in the Attic. The pressure from the record label was crushing their windpipes. Guitarist Joe Perry had shredded his fingers crafting a vicious, driving riff. Frontman Steven Tyler caught the rhythm, but the lyrics remained a desolate void. They were paralyzed. Their nerves were frayed like snapping guitar strings, unable to conjure a single lyric sharp enough to pierce the growling track, desperate to escape the suffocating walls of acoustic foam. The band spilled out onto the neon-soaked streets of New York and slipped into a nearby cinema to numb their minds. The film projecting in the dark that night was Young Frankenstein. They sat in the shadows. The projector flickered. The Transylvania station scene materialized. Marty Feldman handed over the cane and limped away. "Walk this way." Those 3 syllables echoed from the theater speakers. It wasn't just a punchline anymore. To these starving rockers, those 3 beats carried the cadence of a bare-knuckle punch. Producer Jack Douglas shot up in his seat. The rhythm of the phrase locked perfectly, violently, into the unfinished guitar riff Joe Perry had left bleeding in the studio. They stormed out of the theater and sprinted back to the record plant. The paralysis was shattered. Steven Tyler furiously stitched the concepts together and bled the entire lyrical track onto paper that very night. The rest belongs to the mythology of pop culture. The track Walk This Way was born, serving as the battering ram that launched Aerosmith to the summit of rock royalty. A decade later, that very same phantom phrase tore down the walls of musical genres when it collided with hip-hop pioneers Run DMC, cementing its place in the Grammy Hall of Fame. A fleeting moment of rebellion on a movie set didn't just breed a musical leviathan, it birthed a series of unscripted anomalies that would continuously fracture the director's totalitarian grip. 4. The unscripted espresso. The sequence where the blind hermit hosts the hulking monster inside his rotting wooden hovel was meticulously choreographed like a tragicomic pantomime. Every motion, from pouring boiling soup onto the creature's lap to igniting his thumb with fire, was engineered down to the frame to maximize visual devastation. The camera was rolling on the heartbreaking farewell. The script demanded Hackman Project desperate, clawing loneliness as his giant companion fled. Just as the emotional tension reached a fever pitch, Hackman suddenly froze. He didn't look at his co-star. He stared dead through the lens, piercing the darkness toward Mel Brooks behind the monitor, and asked, "Can I try something?" In the domain of comedic heavyweights like Brooks and Wilder, allowing a dramatic crime thriller actor to improvise is playing Russian roulette. But Brooks nodded. The very next second, the film rolled. Hackman reached out into the void, locking his face into a mask of pure, tragic sincerity, and dropped a line violently alien to the 19th century setting. "Where are you going? I was going to make espresso." The mental image of a sleek, modern espresso machine sitting inside the rotting brain of a ragged hermit in the deep forests of Transylvania triggered a jarring temporal displacement. The agonizing tension shattered into a million pieces. The entire crew collapsed into hysterics. That rogue take was immortalized on film because Hackman himself physically could not perform it a second time without breaking character. While this temporal displacement elicited roars of laughter, resurrecting actual death machines from decades past onto the soundstage was a decision drenched in obsession. 5. The awakening of a 43-year-old current Mel Brooks harbored no interest in artificial lightning. He got in his car and drove straight into the dusty outskirts of Los Angeles. He knocked on the door of Kenneth Strickfaden. This was no anonymous technician. Strickfaden was the master architect who had forged the original laboratory machinery for Universal's iconic 1931 Frankenstein. When the rotting wooden doors of the old man's garage creaked open, Brooks was paralyzed. The ancient weather machines, the colossal Tesla coils, the rusted copper switches from 4 decades ago. They were all sitting in the dark, buried under a thick shroud of time. They hadn't been sold for scrap or melted down. They had been quietly awaiting resurrection. Brooks immediately wrote a check, rented the entire original electrical grid, and dragged it back to the 20th century Fox lot. The jagged lightning tearing across the black and white frame. The screaming currents coiling around the monster's flesh that was all entirely real electricity, carrying visceral heat and lethal danger. Strickfaden agreed to unlock his dormant leviathans under one ironclad condition: his name had to be carved into the screen. It was a belated recognition, a sweet, cold vengeance. Because in 1931, the studios had bled him dry and ruthlessly stripped his name from the final credits. The ancient machines were salvaged, but the nostalgic visual format of the film was about to collide with a towering financial wall, threatening to extinguish the project entirely. Before we descend into the most claustrophobic battles behind the lens, if you have followed the shadows this far, now is the time to subscribe. The dark histories unspooling next have been omitted from nearly every behind-the-scenes archive. 6. The $1 million rejection. In the early 1970s, color film was the lifeblood of blockbuster cinema. The studios viewed black and white as an archaic corpse, totally devoid of commercial viability in the international distribution market. Mel Brooks and producer Michael Gruskoff hauled their script to Columbia Pictures. The gray-suited executives entered the boardroom and slid a staggering offer across the table, $1.75 million. It was a sum that would instantly annihilate any constraints regarding set design, props, and talent fees. But chained to that mountain of cash was an absolute ultimatum: the film had to be shot in color. Brooks saw right through their financial facade. He knew the corporate playbook. They promised to strike black and white prints for the American market and reserve color for Europe. But Brooks knew that once the color negative existed, the studio would infect every theater globally to maximize their profit margins. Bleeding color into the frames would trample the haunting, Gothic atmosphere they were desperately clinging to. Without a fraction of a second's hesitation, Brooks and his producer gathered their script, stood up, and walked out the door. They rejected a fortune, turned their backs on Columbia, and marched to 20th Century Fox, the rare sanctuary willing to finance the madness and let them preserve the pure, monochromatic nightmare. While the creators fought off conglomerates to protect the soul of the film, deep within the crew, a background extra was actively burying his own identity to hide from the spotlight. 7. The true heir, hiding in plain sight. The film industry is a fame-devouring machine, a place where people will sacrifice anything to see their name in print. But on the set of Young Frankenstein, one man was working tirelessly to dig a grave for his own identity, among the dozens of extras drifting like ghosts past the camera, draped in the mud-soaked rags of 19th century peasantry, was a man named Clement von Frankenstein. He was not a random wanderer who stumbled through a casting call. He was the direct, living bloodline of the German aristocratic house, the very genesis that inspired Mary Shelley to pen the original Nightmare in 1818. Owning a name with such colossal gravity in pop culture is theoretically a golden ticket in Hollywood. But to Clement, it was a death sentence. He hungered for a legitimate acting career built on bone and muscle, not heritage. He knew that the second his lineage was exposed, the studio PR machine would mutate him into a cheap marketing gimmick, eclipsing his craft forever, trapped between the pride of his ancestors and the brutal survival tactics of Hollywood. He chose to erase himself. Clement signed the contracts under the shroud of a pseudonym, Clement St. George. Throughout the brutal shooting schedule, he stood silently in the mud, arms crossed, watching actors mimic the ghosts of his own family, never breathing a word of his secret to a single soul on set, with the film's aesthetic locked and identities buried. The perfect vacuum was created for the actors to unleash their own psychological warfare, beginning with a silent, optical illusion. 8. The migrating hump. Marty Feldman initiated his psychological game on the very first morning, without a whisper to anyone. This wasn't Feldman's first time weaponizing his own anatomy. He was forged in the fires of British television comedy, where physical subversion was a sharper blade than any written dialogue. His naturally misaligned eyes, a trait most would try to veil, had become the most lethal instrument in his arsenal. He understood, better than anyone, that the camera responds to the lies of the flesh far better than the lies of the tongue. Young Frankenstein was Feldman's maiden voyage into American cinema. The Fox lot was foreign soil, but instead of shrinking into the background, he decided to probe the boundaries of his new reality through a silent experiment, instead of adhering to the strict continuity of Igor's deformity. Feldman quietly tampered with the anatomy. Every morning in the makeup trailer, he detached the prosthetic hump and swapped its location. Left shoulder today, right shoulder tomorrow. He didn't rush it. He showed absolutely no anticipation of a reaction. The entire apparatus of continuity, from veteran cinematographers and script supervisors to the wardrobe department, was so hyper-focused on the crushing schedule that not a single person registered the mutating geometry of his spine. And it wasn't entirely their fault. Inside the meat grinder of a film set, you look at the light, the frame, the eyeline. Nobody looks at the hump. The silent game dragged on for days. infecting dozens of setups without ever triggering an alarm. It was the cast, not the technicians, who began to question their own sanity first. An extra would glance at Feldman between setups, tilting their head, then another. Paranoid glances were exchanged across the soundstage. No one was entirely sure if their memory was failing them. Feldman stood there, his face an impenetrable mask. When Mel Brooks finally caught the terrifying continuity error on his monitor, his reaction wasn't rage. Instead of screaming "cut" or punishing Feldman for sabotaging the negative, Brooks recognized the biting satire in the prank. It wasn't a flaw to be repaired, it was ammunition. He kept the ruined footage, wrote the mutation directly into the script, and forced Wilder to stop and ask, "Didn't you have that hump on the other side yesterday?" Igor stared dead into his eyes, unblinking, and shot back, "What hump?" Those two words, delivered with Feldman's chilling, hollow stare, slammed the door on reality. No denial, no exposition. Just a counter-interrogation that forced the crushing weight of absurdity onto the man seeking logic. It is the anatomy of a flawless farce. The man who spots the insanity becomes the madman. This calculated optical gaslighting became one of the most legendary fixtures of the film, and while a physical illusion slipped smoothly under the radar. A completely baseless linguistic rumor morphed into the loudest sound echoing through the castle. 9. The shriek of horses in the dead of night. The name Frau Bluscher was born out of a total, macabre misunderstanding. Mel Brooks had absorbed a piece of fabricated trivia from pseudo-linguists claiming that Bluscher, the title of the decaying castle's housekeeper, translated to glue in Old German. This immediately triggered a chilling association with the animal rendering industry, specifically the boiling of horse bones to harvest adhesive. Even though, in reality, Blicher is nothing more than a standard German surname completely devoid of murderous intent. Brooks weaponized the illusion. He forged it into a psychological trigger every single time the name Blicher was uttered into the ether. The horses trapped in the courtyard below would shriek in pure terror, as if the phantom scent of death had drifted into their stalls. Actress Cloris Leachman anchored this psychological terror by maintaining a face as cold and unyielding as a marble tombstone. She refused to let a single micro-expression slip as the chaotic screaming erupted behind her, cultivating an atmosphere that was suffocatingly grim. While the horses screamed in manufactured terror, a very real, quiet romance was taking root beneath the most repulsive skin imaginable. 10. A proposition. Beneath the monster's skin, Rolling Stone reporter Lorraine Alterman stepped into the shadows of the 20th Century Fox lot, armed with a notebook, hunting for the pulse of the production amidst the chaotic labyrinth of cables and heavy-set lights. She found herself face-to-face with Peter Boyle. Boyle was not radiating the polished aura of a Hollywood leading man. He was entombed beneath the grotesque, suffocating latex of the monster, a heavy gray-green visage, a swollen, mutated rubber brow, massive jagged dentures, and thick, angry stitches sutured across his throat. The massive padded suit forced him to move with terrifying, mechanical slowness. Most men would shrink inward, utterly stripped of their confidence while wearing the face of a nightmare, especially when confronting a New York journalist. But Boyle didn't flinch. He walked straight toward Lorraine, stared right through the suffocating rubber, and with a deep, resonant voice, directly asked her out to dinner. That sheer, piercing confidence shattered the physical barrier of the monster. She nodded. That surreal collision in the dark corners of the soundstage wasn't just a piece of Hollywood lore, it was the genesis of a lifelong pact. They married in 1977, 30 years later. As Boyle drew his final breath, Lorraine was right there, holding his hand. While human connection thrived despite the prosthetics, maintaining order on a set spiraling into madness required the director to enforce a brutal physical discipline. 11. The Forest of White Handkerchiefs. Expensive 35mm film stock was evaporating along with the studio's budget, and the assassins weren't faulty cameras or blown bulbs. The greatest enemy of the production schedule was the involuntary. Explosive laughter of the cast and the crew hiding behind the lights. The ensemble of young Frankenstein was a powder keg of comedic dynamite. A micro-expression from Gene Wilder, a deranged twitch from Marty Feldman, or a perfectly mistimed groan from Peter Boyle was enough to shatter the silence. Dozens of pristine takes were butchered, audio tracks were ruined. Mel Brooks stood helplessly watching studio money burn to ash with every muffled giggle. Realizing the asylum was being overrun, Brooks didn't scream. He instituted an unprecedented physical suppression protocol, distributing stark, bone-white handkerchiefs to every single human being on the soundstage, from the gaffers in the rafters to the boom operators in the shadows. The mandate was absolute the moment the camera rolled. Anyone who felt their throat twitching with laughter was ordered to violently stuff the cloth into their own mouth. No exceptions. Brooks later recounted directing in the pitch black, looking around the periphery of the sets to witness a forest of white handkerchiefs puffing and violently shaking in every dark corner of the soundstage. The entire crew was gagged, forced into compulsory silence, leaving a sterile void for the actors to unleash their verbal blades. 12. The razor-sharp rejection. The camera rolled on the foggy, atmospheric train station farewell. Gene Wilder, as the ambitious doctor, was boarding his fate to Transylvania. Standing opposite him was his impeccably dressed fiancée, Elizabeth, played by Madeline Kahn. The script demanded a sterile, performative kiss emotion designed to highlight the frigid, artificial nature of the aristocracy. Madeline Kahn did not move. She possessed the killer instinct of a metronome. She wasn't rushed. Kahn waited for the exact microsecond Wilder's face eclipsed hers, and coldly dropped a line that existed on no script, no tongues. That single, surgical strike of timing and verbal restraint earned her a nomination for a Golden Globe, while an actress seized control of her destiny with a two-word blade. The leading man was using his leverage to amputate a deeply ingrained habit from his director. 13. The banishment of Mel Brooks. From the very second the contracts were drawn, Gene Wilder carved an iron boundary into the negotiating table. Mel Brooks suffered from the classic affliction of the auteur, a desperate hunger for the spotlight. He was notorious for writing himself into cameo roles, leaving his physical fingerprint on nearly every world he built. It was his signature. But Wilder ruthlessly vetoed this gimmick from entering his Gothic kingdom. Wilder locked eyes with Brooks and delivered a final decree. You can direct, but you cannot be in the film. Wilder understood the fragile ecosystem of young Frankenstein. It was a parody, yes, but its survival depended on the actors treating the absurdity with deadly, terrifying sincerity. If Mel Brooks's famous hypercomedic face suddenly breached the frame, the 1930s illusion would shatter like glass. Brooks nodded. He retreated behind the lens, banished to the shadows until the final frame was exposed, but blocked from the light of the projector. The obsessive director tunneled beneath the floorboards, finding a subliminal way to infiltrate the audience's mind. 14. The invisible voices. Mel Brooks pushed open the heavy door to the post-production sound booth and sealed the acoustic chamber behind him. Stripped of his physical presence by Wilder's ironclad contract, Brooks refused to be entirely erased. He decided to weaponize his own anatomy. Trapped in a claustrophobic room lined with jagged acoustic foam, Brooks stood alone before the microphone and began an invisible performance. That blood-curdling wolf howl ripping through the dead of night, the feral midnight screech of the alley cat, even the deafening, mechanical scream of the train whistle echoing off the mountains. None of them were pulled from a dusty archival tape. It was Brooks. He physically distorted his own larynx, pushing his vocal cords to their absolute breaking point to birth every feral noise in the film. Millions of viewers sat in the dark, howling at the on-screen madness. Completely unaware, they were intimately listening to the very breath and screams of the director haunting the entire runtime of the film. Brooks retained absolute control over the invisible realm of sound, but he completely lost his mind when confronted with the most psychotic idea of the production. 15. The 20-minute war of putting on the Ritz. Gene Wilder slammed the rough draft onto the wooden table. His proposition, the Doctor and the grotesque monster would drape themselves in high society tuxedos, don top hats, and perform a tap dance routine to Irving Berlin's Puttin' on the Ritz. Mel Brooks didn't just disagree. He swept the papers off the desk. The cramped office rapidly deteriorated into a merciless battlefield. Brooks screamed, "You want to tap dance to Irving Berlin with a freak of nature. It will burn the movie to the ground. The audience will walk out." The two men locked horns in a savage 20-minute screaming match. Throats were shredded, voices turned to gravel, faces flushed with absolute rage. The friction spiked so violently that the entire film threatened to collapse in that very room. Finally, crushed by Wilder's unyielding fanaticism, Brooks slammed his fist on the desk and surrendered. He didn't believe in the vision, he just didn't want the movie to die. Months later, sitting in the pitch-black screening room reviewing the rough cut, the projector threw the monochromatic light onto the silver screen. Brooks sat paralyzed in silence. The dance sequence played, the collision of elegant rhythm against the clumsy, agonizing groans of the rotting monster didn't destroy the narrative logic as he had feared. Instead, the sheer brazen absurdity of it drilled right into the audience's psyche, detonating into absolute perfection, burying the ego of a stubborn auteur. Brooks stepped into the light and confessed to the press the exact sequence he had tried to slaughter with his bare hands had become the crowning achievement of his entire cinematic legacy. Young Frankenstein was a true laboratory, a volatile chamber where the sharpest, most jagged egos of the 1970s violently collided. For many of us, this film takes the shape of a frantic Friday night, clutching a plastic VHS case from Blockbuster. It's the ritual of shoving the tape into the VCR, sitting cross-legged in the glow of a heavy CRT television, and laughing until our lungs gave out. And decades later, the cycle repeats as we point at flat screens, reciting those razor-sharp lines to the next generation of our bloodline. But the black and white phantom we have rewound for decades is not the complete truth. There are secrets ruthlessly butchered on the cutting room floor. Legends of cinema like John Carradine and Leon Askin were physically there. They wore the makeup, spoke the lines, and burned their souls into the celluloid. Only for Mel Brooks to mercilessly decapitate their scenes from the final negative to enforce his brutal, unyielding pacing. Where in the subterranean vaults of Hollywood are those pristine reels rotting away does a phantom? Uncut master exists in the dark, waiting to be unearthed. It remains a cold case, buried under 50 years of dust. When your final VHS tape degrades to static, which scene from this masterpiece will still echo in your mind? Leave that memory in the abyss of the comments below.